Welcome to Sleepless Echoes, where the past refuses to sleep. When the Majapahit Empire collapsed in 1527, the priests did something unusual. They didn't try to save the texts. The texts were already gone. Instead, they fled to a small island to the east, and they kept playing. Majapahit had been the dominant power in Southeast Asia for 2 centuries. Its courts filled with Sanskrit scholars, priests, and poets. Its royal libraries held texts on astronomy, medicine, cosmology, and governance. Its artisans built temples that are still standing. When the Islamic sultanates expanded across Java and the empire fractured and fell, the courts emptied. The priests dispersed. The libraries, what happened to them is not entirely clear. Stone is clear. Stone survives. Text does not always. Within 2 generations, the cosmological system that Majapahit had spent 2 centuries building was politically extinct. But in the villages, in the temple courtyards, in the open-air pavilions of Java and Bali, the ancient Asian music survived. The gamelan ensembles kept playing. The specific tuning of the bronze keys, encoding the relationships between tones that Majapahit's priests had considered a map of cosmic order. That tuning was never written down, which meant it was never subject to fire. The music had not been deliberately preserved. It had simply been too distributed, too embodied, too woven into daily ceremony and family life for any conquering force to find and dismantle. 500 years later, you can sit in a temple in Bali and hear, without any translation, a civilization that officially ended in 1527. Consider what that means. Not the music of that civilization as scholars have reconstructed it from notation, not an approximation, the actual music, unchanged, alive. This is the question that ancient Asian music history keeps posing, the question this episode is built around. How does knowledge held in human bodies outlast knowledge held in stone? And why is the answer, almost every time, that someone decided it was worth passing on? To understand why gamelan survived, you first have to understand what gamelan is and what it is not. Gamelan is not an instrument, it is an ensemble, a community of objects that must be played together, tuned to each other, by musicians who have learned to listen to each other with unusual care. A typical Javanese gamelan includes bronze gong kettles arranged in rows, metallophones of different sizes, large hanging gongs, tuned drums, and sometimes flute, string instruments, and voice. The ensemble can have 20 musicians or more, each with a specific role, each instrument representing a specific layer of the sonic architecture. Here is the first thing to understand. Each gamelan is unique. There is no standard tuning. The Slendro and Pelog scales that Javanese gamelan uses do not map to Western equal temperament. Each ensemble is tuned slightly differently from every other ensemble. Each set of instruments is named. Playing an instrument from a different ensemble without permission is considered disrespectful. Not rude, disrespectful, in the way that one speaks carefully about a living thing. This is not an aesthetic preference. It is a cosmological position. The specific relationships between tones in a gamelan ensemble are not arbitrary. They encode a particular understanding of the structure of the universe. The music is not about the music. The music is about something the music is pointing toward. In the Majapahit court, gamelan was the sonic backbone of Wayang Kulit, the shadow puppet theater that dramatized the Hindu epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana. These were not entertainment performances. They were ritual events. The Dalang, the puppet master, was a kind of priest. The performance enacted the story of the cosmos. The gamelan did not accompany this, it constituted it. Without the music, the ritual was incomplete. We know this reaches back at least to the 9th century. The reliefs at Borobudur, carved when the Majapahit Empire did not yet exist, show gamelan-like ensembles clearly. This is not a tradition that Majapahit invented. It is a tradition that Majapahit inherited and deepened, and made central to its understanding of what a civilization should sound like. When Majapahit fell and the Islamic sultanates took control of Java, something interesting happened. Gamelan did not stop. The new courts absorbed it. The music had been adapted for Hindu-Buddhist ceremony, but it was adaptable. It could be reconfigured for new ceremonial contexts. The Dutch colonial period, which began in earnest in the 17th century, was more threatening. Certain ceremonies were restricted or banned. Court patronage was disrupted or redirected through Dutch-controlled channels. And still gamelan survived. It survived through the Karawitan tradition, the village-level ensembles that existed completely independently of court patronage. In Java, in hundreds of villages, there were community gamelan groups that played for ceremonies, for seasonal events, for births and funerals and harvests. These ensembles were not dependent on any sultan or any colonial authority. They belonged to the village. They could not be abolished by removing a patron. And then there is Bali. When Majapahit's Hindu-Buddhist elite fled the expanding Islamic sultanates, many of them went to Bali, the small island to the east. Bali remained Hindu. They brought with them the court traditions they had carried for centuries. Bali did not merely remember Majapahit. It became the place where Majapahit continued living. Balinese gamelan today preserves a version of the Majapahit court tradition that has been performed continuously for over 500 years. The specific ensemble types, the Gamba court music ensemble, the Legong ceremonial tradition, the Gong Kebiar festival style, each carries within it a different layer. These styles represent what the Majapahit court considered civilized sound, preserving a rich cultural heritage through music and dance. Every week in temples across Bali, gamelan is played as part of active religious ceremony. This is not performance, this is practice. The music is still doing what it was built to do, connecting the visible world to the world behind it, making the cosmic order audible. The cosmological order of Majapahit, a civilization that officially ended 500 years ago, is still audible in the tuning of every gamelan ensemble. Not because anyone saved it, because it was too alive to die. Gamelan survived because it belonged to everyone, distributed across hundreds of villages. Embedded in daily life, too dispersed for any single force to locate and remove. But that is not the only shape a survival can take. On the other side of the continent, a musical tradition survived the opposite way, held by a handful of families, formally documented, entirely dependent on the patronage of an imperial court, and yet it outlasted every dynasty that tried to discard it. There is a sound associated with the Japanese imperial court that has no equivalent anywhere in the world. The sho, a mouth organ of 17 bamboo pipes arranged like a phoenix's wings, produces suspended chords that seem to hang in the air. The Hichiriki, a small double-reed pipe, cuts through everything else, thin, urgent, impossible to ignore. Together they create a texture unlike any other music, slow, suspended, slightly otherworldly. The feeling is of standing at the edge of a ceremony that has been happening since before you arrived and will continue after you leave. This music is called Gagaku, Ga meaning elegant or refined, Gaku meaning music. In 701 CE, the Japanese imperial court formally established a music bureau. The music bureau, known as the Gagaku Ryo, was created to oversee and preserve the court music traditions imported from the Korean peninsula and Tang dynasty China. Gagaku arrived in Japan as part of a systematic import of continental civilization. In the 6th through 8th centuries, Japan's ruling elite engaged in societal transformation. Using Tang dynasty China as a template, Japan's elite embraced Buddhism, the Chinese writing system, urban planning, legal codes, and administrative structures. Court music was not supplementary to a civilized state. It was part of what a civilized state was, integral to the cultural identity and governance. During the Heian period, the centuries in which the tale of Genji was written, aristocratic Japanese culture reached the height of its refinement. Gagaku was the sonic signature of existence. Specific pieces were performed at specific ceremonies at specific times of the year. The music was embedded in the ritual calendar in a way that made it structurally necessary. Without the music, the ceremony was incomplete. Without the ceremony, the season was wrong. The music held the year together. Then the Sengoku period came. The Sengoku, the age of warring states, lasted from roughly 1467 to 1615. It was one of the most destructive periods in Japanese history. The imperial court, already weakened, was reduced to near irrelevance. The emperor was sometimes so impoverished that official ceremonies were delayed for lack of funds. The elaborate cultural apparatus of the Heian court, the elaborate poetry traditions, the court rituals, the ceremonial calendar, much of it withered. Consider the comparison. In Europe, court music traditions that lost their patrons during periods of similar upheaval tended to survive only in fragments. Manuscripts were copied by monks, later reconstructed by scholars who could read the notation, but had no living memory of how it was performed. The music became archaeological. Gagaku did not. Gagaku survived because it was held by hereditary families. the Abe family, the Toyohara family, the Ojiri family, these lineages had been the custodians of specific Gagaku traditions for generations. When the court could no longer pay, the families did not stop. They played for each other. They taught their children. The transmission continued not because an institution supported it, but because the families considered it theirs, knowledge held by blood passed through blood. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration began. This was, by design, the most aggressive cultural transformation in Japanese history. The new government's goal was modernization fast enough to prevent colonization by Western powers. Western dress became mandatory for officials. Western legal codes replaced traditional law. Traditional cultural practices were, in many domains, deliberately dismantled. Gagaku was not dismantled. The Meiji government reconstituted the Imperial Household Agency's music department and placed Gagaku under formal state protection. The reason was not nostalgia. It was not a romantic impulse to preserve something beautiful. The Meiji government needed the emperor to be divine. A divine emperor required a ritual calendar. The ritual calendar required the specific music that had defined it for 12 centuries. Gagaku was too useful to abandon. The preservation was a political decision. The ancient music made the modern project possible. Today, Gagaku is performed at the Imperial household in Tokyo, in ceremonies that have been continuous for 1,300 years. The piece called Etenraku, one of the most performed works in the repertoire, appears in 10th century Heian manuscripts. It sounds today approximately as it sounded in the Heian court. This is not reconstruction. The piece was never lost and recovered. It was transmitted, teacher to student, family to family, through the Sengoku Wars and the Meiji Revolution and the Second World War. The sound of 7th century China is still audible in Tokyo. Not in a museum, in a ceremony. Gagaku survived because a state decided it was too politically useful to let die. But the third tradition in this story survived for a different reason entirely, not because it was community-owned like Gamelan, not because it was state-protected like Gagaku, but because the people who held it made a decision, thousands of years ago, that some knowledge should never be written down at all, that there are things which can only live in the space between a teacher and a student. Around the 2nd century BCE, a group of scholars in South Asia began writing a comprehensive treatise on performance. The Natya Shastra covered theater, music, dance, gesture, and the philosophy underlying all three, running to approximately 40,000 verses. It specified the intervals between notes, the emotional qualities of different scales, and the theory of Rasa, 9 fundamental emotional states. The treatise laid out, in precise and systematic terms, everything that could be said in words about the art of performance. And then it stopped. The actual ragas, the living, performed music, the scholars left to be transmitted orally. The knowledge that could be written was written. The knowledge that could not be written was passed from teacher to student, lips to ears. Repeated until it became muscle memory, until the student's body understood what words could only gesture toward. A raga is not a scale. This is the most important thing to understand. A scale is a set of pitches. A raga specifies which notes may be used, and often the ascending and descending rules differ. You go up through certain notes, and come down through different ones. But a raga also specifies which ornaments are appropriate. The slides between notes, the oscillations, the microtonal inflections that place a performance in a specific school and a specific emotional register. It specifies which note is the most important, the vadi, the note the raga keeps returning to, that the listener begins to feel as home. It specifies the emotional quality, the rasa, the raga creates. And it specifies when it should be performed, the time of day, the season, the occasion. No notation captures all of this. The notation would give you the pitches. It would give you the ascending and descending pattern. And it would leave out almost everything that makes a raga itself. Ragas for different times of day are genuinely different in character. A morning raga and an evening raga are not the same music in a different slot. They encode a different relationship to consciousness, to light. The traditions claim, and it is not presented as metaphor but as technical description, is that if you play a morning raga at midnight, it sounds wrong. Not just conventionally, but essentially. The music is out of its time. The relationship between the sound and the world has been broken. Think about what this means. The tradition is not saying that convention assigns certain music to certain times. It is saying that the music and the time of day are in a real, describable relationship, and that the musician's job is to understand that relationship well enough to inhabit it. That understanding cannot be written. It can only be demonstrated, repeated, corrected until it is in the body. The Guru Shishya Parampara, the lineage of teacher to student, is not a teaching method. It is the technology of preservation itself. A student lives near their teacher for years. They learn not from texts but from direct transmission. The teacher performs, the student absorbs. The teacher corrects the student's body until the music is in the student's hands and breath and attention in a way that cannot be extracted or falsified. This is deliberately not transcribable. The gamak, the ornamental slides and oscillations, differ between schools. The same raga in the Delhi Gharana sounds different. The same raga in the Jaipur Gharana sounds different from the Karana Gharana. These differences are not mistakes or regional variations. They are the identity of the tradition. They are what make each school a distinct living thing. Notation would flatten them into a single version. When the Delhi Sultanate replaced the Hindu courts that had originally patronized North Indian classical music in the 12th century, the music faced a choice: adapt or disappear. It adapted. The Mughal courts, who replaced the Delhi Sultanate in the 16th century, were among the most enthusiastic patrons. Tansen, whom Akbar made one of the Navaratnas, the 9 jewels of his court, is a figure whose compositions are still performed. The tradition migrated across the religious divide because the Mughal aristocracy genuinely found value in it. The Gharana system created multiple independent transmission nodes. Each Gharana maintained its own style, its own repertoire, its own understanding of how specific ragas should be performed. If one node was disrupted, a city conquered, a patron assassinated, a family dispersed, the others continued. The tradition was too distributed to be destroyed at a single point. In South India, Carnatic classical music faced the British colonial period differently. Western music education was imposed through the school system. The response, the Bhakti devotion tradition, in which music was inseparable from Hindu temple practice, made the tradition nearly immune to colonial educational policy. The colonial administration could control the curriculum. It could not easily control what happened in temples, in homes, in the intimate transmission between a guru and a student who came to learn something that no school could teach. A raga performed correctly at dawn is a 2,000-year-old philosophical argument made audible. It argues that the universe has an order, that time of day has a texture, that human consciousness changes with the light in specific, describable ways, that music can invoke those textures deliberately, not accidentally, that if you sit with a teacher long enough, if you practice long enough, if you play long enough, you will eventually feel. Not understand intellectually, but feel the relationship between the sound and the moment that the tradition has been pointing toward for 2,000 years. Generation after generation, people sat with that claim and found it true. That is why the chain of transmission has never been broken. We began with a question: how does music survive what writing cannot? The answer is not romantic, it is structural. Writing is a technology that requires a surface, a custodian, and an institution to protect them. A library requires walls. Walls require a state. States collapse. When the state goes, the library often goes with it. The library of Majapahit was not preserved because there was no institution left to preserve it. The chronicles of civilizations that no one thought to copy were lost. Stone is more durable than parchment, but even stone requires someone to read it. Music held in bodies requires none of this. It requires only that people find it worth transmitting, that they consider it worth passing from their hands to someone else's, that they make a judgment, repeated every generation, that this knowledge should not stop here. And when that transmission holds, when living knowledge reaches beyond its origin, it changes the world in ways a burned library never could. In 1889, a Javanese Gamelan ensemble performed at the Paris World's Fair. Among the people who heard it was a French composer named Claude Debussy. He was 26 years old. He had never heard anything like it. The specific quality of the gamelan's tuning, the way the bronze keys resonated, without resolving into the neat cadences of Western harmony, broke something open in how he thought about sound. His music changed afterward. The shimmering, suspended quality of his piano writing, pieces like La Cathédrale Inglauti, the Preludes, carries within it the direct influence of what he heard in that pavilion. The direct influence of what he heard in that pavilion. The cosmological order of Majapahit, transmitted through 500 years of Javanese and Balinese village ceremony, reached Paris and reshaped European classical music. The gamelan musician in a Javanese village who teaches his child the specific way to strike the bronze keys is not archiving. He is not preserving. He is continuing. He is making a judgment, the same judgment, repeated for 500 years since Majapahit fell, that this knowledge is worth the time it takes to pass it along. That judgment is why the cosmological order of Majapahit is still audible. That judgment is why a French composer heard it in 1889 and could not unhear it. The Gagaku family that kept playing through the Sengoku wars, when there was no court to perform for, no audience beyond each other, it would have been easier to stop. The tradition continued because enough people in every generation decided it shouldn't. The Raga guru who sits with a student for years, listening for the moment when the student's body finally understands what words could only approximate. The civilizations built libraries, the empires commissioned chronicles and inscriptions, the dynasties carved their achievements in stone. Almost none of it survived as well as the music. Not because music is magic, because music held in bodies is harder to destroy than stone. Arc 3 has one thread remaining. We have seen the spice routes that rewrote what Asia believes. We have seen the civilizations that kept memory in bodies when the libraries burned. The final question is, what does it mean to remember? What is memory for, not in music, not in spices, not in a single civilization, but as a philosophical act? Arc 3 closes with the philosophy of memory, with what it means that we remember at all.